Hello, everyone, and thank you for being at our panel today. My name is Melissa Ryan. I am the editor of Control, Alt, Right, Delete, the founder of Card Strategies. Part of my work with Card Strategies, I have been working with the Anti-Climate Disinfo Coalition, or ACDC, for the past few years, and really gotten a front row seat, not just to the catastrophic problem that is climate change and disinformation about climate change, but some of the work that is being done in policy, in tech advocacy, on the front lines. And so today, my goal is to talk as little as possible because we have an amazing panel of experts here. And so I'm going to let each one of these folks introduce themselves, give a presentation or a little bit of a talk, and then we should have plenty of time for some questions from me and time for questions from the audience as well, because hopefully after all these presentations, you will have much to be curious about and questions as well. And then, so you know who everyone is, I have names and Twitter handles, and I am going to turn it over to Michael Koo, who is the chair of the Anti-Disinformation Climate Coalition, to start us off.
Great, thanks you, Melissa. Hi, and thanks to Netroots for bringing us all back together. It is so good to see people and be with our tribe. I'd like to start with a story about Texas, and it begins in the winter of 2021 when Texas had a historic snowstorm. As you can imagine, Texas is not used to this sort of extreme climate disaster, and as a result, the power grid failed miserably and hundreds of people died. We saw the widespread failure of the fossil fuel infrastructure, oil and gas pipelines that froze up, and the deregulated and isolated electrical grid that was unable to deliver power. It was a perfect demonstration of everything that's wrong with the American oil and gas industry. They create an extreme climate event, and then they create an extremely capitalist and fragile infrastructure. But on social media, there was a vastly different story building up. A few days into the storm, a single account on Twitter with the handle Oilfield Rando posted an image of a frozen windmill, blaming this as a cause of the power outage and people suffering. The image was actually from Sweden from 2015, but it rapidly became a meme. Within a few days, it was retweeted by larger accounts, and a day later, it was on Fox News with Tucker Carlson spewing bile about the failings of a non-existent Green New Deal. By day 4, it became a talking point for Governor Greg Abbott. The problem with America, they pose, is that we've been trapped by these pansy liberals and their weak renewable power. This extreme distortion of an extreme weather event was terrible and unnecessary. One part of this isn't new. There's a long history of climate denialism from Exxon on down from the last 50 years that people like Amy Westervelt and others have documented. But that type of blatant climate denial was on its deathbed in the early 2000s. Hucksters like Bjorn Lomborg and other middle-aged white men, pseudo-turncoats who said they used to be liberal, they all had declining audiences as people exposed their inconvenient lies. But over the last decade, a tiny minority was given a massive and algorithmically enhanced megaphone to flood the public square, to upend the level playing field that the internet once promised, so that the very few will get to dominate the many. We wouldn't face such resistance to climate action or to many other progressive goals that we believe in, like LGBT rights or abortion, today if it were not for the big tech platforms giving such a small, radical minority vastly outsized power. Now, when we met with Facebook shortly before the storm, I think our coalition's now met with 27 different staff people at Facebook, all really unproductive discussions. When we met with them shortly before the storm, we warned them that this could happen, and we even gave them the names of the accounts where we expected it to flourish. But when we met with them weeks later after the storm, Facebook's response to us was that this wasn't a big deal, that we didn't know what we were talking about, and that people should just be more media literate. We should go visit their fancy new science center to see how pretty it is. So we looked into it a little bit more deeply, and we found out that 99% of the fake images weren't even fact-checked. Phil Newell's going to talk a little bit more later on about the total failure of their science center, in addition to the failure of the basic algorithm. This is a ridiculous state of affairs, and I think we need to maintain that initial disbelief. This isn't the fault of people who need to learn media literacy, or even your racist uncle who shares terrible memes. This is a system designed to bring out the worst and obscure how that happens from the public. We can't play an endless game of climate whack-a-mole to stop these people from artificially being amplified. We need to stop the amplifiers. Over the last 4 years, we and others in the progressive movement have slowly and with very little funding built disinformation campaigns. Our core theory of change is whether you believe in trans youth rights or abortion, we're all going to be unable to achieve our goals if we don't stop the added power that the amplification by big tech is giving to our enemies. We've now built a coalition to include about 36 US environmental groups and are partnered with an equal amount in the EU and the UK now, and deeply connected with reproductive health, civil rights, and LGBT groups, activists who are all calling for very similar reforms. I should back up for a second just to show the immense amount of research that we had to do to convince platforms in Congress that this is a real issue. Can you go to that one slide with the picture of AOC? There we go. Sorry, that one. Back in 2019, we documented how AOC became the very first viral denial moment. The right wing has always disliked climate change, but they never lost their mind quite like they did when the Green New Deal was introduced by a young woman of color. We documented how climate deniers merged with QAnon and became a roving band of anti-maskers and misogynists. We documented a rise in climate disinformation, especially after Biden was elected. Our campaign is now focused on demanding basic transparency from the tech companies. And let's be clear, these companies exist in a special space where they're held to almost no account. Mark Zuckerberg lies under oath to Congress and nothing happens. Elon Musk lies repeatedly to the SEC, nothing happens. That's not the way things happen in the real world that the rest of us are subjected to. If you're a company who makes a baby seat that fails and kills children, you get sued, you go to jail. If a plane crashes, we extract the flight recorder and we actually share that data, their worst data. We share it with everyone. And again, the companies are held to account. Somehow, the tech industry has avoided this basic concept that applies to almost every other American product, from airplanes to Zippo lighters. Fortunately, and I'll end here, there is some hope. Over the last year, big tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google have been stumbling over themselves to show that they're taking some kind of proactive action on climate disinformation and other issues. If there's one victory our broad community has helped secure amidst this horror, it's that we've removed the social license to spread disinformation. Unfortunately, the European Union recently passed landmark regulation on big tech that will help change that landscape. It'll enforce fair competition and require basic transparency on the harms, the products that they create. And disinformation is still terrible on social media, but at least today, companies are in the position of saying they deny it or trying to deny it. The EU's Digital Services Act is going to screw them on this because they will continue to deny, but we will have the power and the transparency to expose it further and further. It's often a dark landscape to talk about either climate change or tech policy, but this is a rare moment of hope where climate change, a privileged and well-resourced movement, can help drive a wedge alongside our progressive allies to benefit us all. With that, I'll pass it over to Allison.
We have Allison Fisher from Media Matters.
Hello. Okay. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Allison Fisher. I'm the director of the Climate and Energy Program at Media Matters, as Melissa already said. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate disinformation in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Are my slides up there? You can go for the first slide. Okay. Have folks seen this or some version of this online or in real life? Yeah. So these stickers are one of the manifestations of one of the more prolific threads of disinformation in the wake of the war. You had conservative politicians, right-wing media figures and outlets, fossil fuel industry spokespersons, and other bad actors repeatedly making the claim that Biden's climate and energy policies, and those policies alone, were responsible for rising gas prices. So now these claims on gas prices were prevalent even before the war, as the gas prices started to rebound in the fall of 2021, but they absolutely started to explode and gain steam as the sanctions and other disruptions from the war made those prices go into record high levels. So gas prices obviously are not the only source of disinformation during this period, but just in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on these particular claims. So what I'm going to do is just throw up some data and then talk a little bit about what insights we might be able to glean from these numbers. So is the data slide up there? Okay. All right, so we have a little bit of a snapshot of data that illustrates both the volume and the high engagement around gas price narratives and misinformation. So you see the idea of energy independence. This is invoked repeatedly online and also on air. So this is the idea that increased domestic drilling will somehow shield the US from oil, so global oil disruptions, right? You see the Keystone Pipeline also invoked repeatedly, in this case by Fox News. Again, this is the idea that Keystone is both the reason for the cancellation of it is the reason for high gas prices, and also the solution to high gas prices. If we look at that top number, the 100 post, during the same time period associated with climate and energy, we see that nearly half of those posts are related or pushing misinformation related to gas prices. Many are using, again, energy independence as a way to shift blame for gas prices onto Biden. Okay, so not included in this data set, but something I wanted to also draw attention to in part of a separate review. What Media Matters also discovered was during this period, bad actors were directly blaming climate activists for the policies that they were claiming emboldened Putin to invade, and also made the countries that were suffering from the war vulnerable to high gas prices and price scarcity. So let's look at a couple of examples of that. You can do the next slide. Okay, so this post is from Matt Walsh. You can see that he's directly blaming Greta Thunberg for energy insecurity in the West. And for those uninitiated about Matt Walsh, I'll go ahead and say a few things if you want to add. So he is a commentator on the right. He has a column on the Daily Wire. He has his own podcast, and he is regularly featured on Fox News. Am I forgetting anything? Or is that a good CV for him? Yeah, lots of good things. Okay, let's look at another example. So this post shows a clip from Steve Bannon's podcast War Room, making a very similar claim. And the thing that I want to stress here is that both of these folks are prominent right-wing media figures, but they certainly were not alone. We see many of them pushing the same claim in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. Okay, so again, this data and these representative examples are just showing that the right and some other bad actors are pushing these particular strands of climate disinformation repeatedly and across many platforms. And that's the important piece here, repeatedly and across many platforms. So we've moved on to the takeaways. Okay, great. So these are the 5 points I want to leave folks with. I will try to get through them pretty quickly. Looking at the first bullet, I included Fox data alongside online data primarily to illustrate how online climate disinformation is not necessarily separate from climate disinformation in other media landscapes. So here I'm talking about print, I'm talking about radio, podcast, in this case cable, but rather they are a continuum of or an amplifier for one another. Fox News, unfortunately, is the most watched cable news network in America. Its most influential personality, Tucker Carlson, pulls in about 3 million viewers a night. What he says on air is often turned into online content or online misinformation. Sean Hannity, who's another primetime Fox personality, also hosts a radio program. He gets 15 million listeners across the country each day for his program. He also has a very significant presence online. So this is a segue into the second bullet. Climate disinformation superspreaders are often not single issue, but rather multi-issue influencers. So yeah, we do have to focus on what is happening on channels like Bjorn Lomborg's channels and Michael Schellenberg's channels. They're often the originator of this content, but the people that are really amplifying and pushing this into bigger audiences are folks like Sean Hannity, Ben Shapiro, and some of these other multi-issue folks. What we have found is that Hannity included other Fox personalities and some of the contributors from Fox as well. They're regularly appearing as top performing online posts about climate and energy issues. So this is in stuff that we've examined at Media Matters. Our partners have also found that right-wing media outlets like Breitbart, Newsmax, and Daily Wire are among among the worst offenders of climate disinformation. So these actors, again, if they're not the originator or the creator, they're pushing and spreading disinformation to much larger audiences and even moving fringe disinformation or conspiracies into the mainstream. Okay, third bullet. Oh no, we're staying on this last slide, okay. What does it say? Sorry, folks. The most effective disinformation connects to a broader story or narrative already established by bad actors. So again, looking at gas prices, pitting high gas prices to Biden and climate and other climate policies feeds into an existing narrative about climate action, primarily that it harms Americans, specifically that it makes energy unaffordable or scarce, while at the same time it's reinforcing this idea that we need to keep our economy based on fossil fuels, so maintaining that status quo. Now, I think this is really important because, as we think about the distinction between misinformation and disinformation, we also want to consider the term disinformation is referring to false or misleading information intentionally spread not just to harm, but in this case to advance political and ideological goals. Okay, and so this is not the final point, point 4. Repetition increases belief in false statements. Repetition increases belief in false statements. We know this to be true from the literature, but probably in our own experience. And let me tell you that the right is particularly adept at this. They are really good at collectively zeroing in on a narrative or a lie and repeating it until it's their conventional wisdom. This repetition can also create symbols or buzzwords that can then later on be invoked to immediately signal outrage or meaning without much explanation. So again, as we're looking at the data around the volume of mentions related to energy independence and the Keystone Pipeline, which has certainly become a symbol for the right. It's a symbol on the left too, but on the right for sure. And then, again, thinking about how I showed you the examples of the right-wing media figures citing Greta Thunberg as somehow responsible for Putin's actions, the right has spent years vilifying Greta since she was very young and making her a symbol of climate alarmism. And this is important because in these moments, in these key climate and energy moments, they can then slip her name in or insert one of these other terms and immediately invoke outrage and meaning in their intended audiences, whether it's in Tucker Carlson's monologue, whether it's in a post by Ben Shapiro, or some other form of content. As they're using these things that they've repeatedly talked about, they immediately signal outrage and meaning for their audiences. We talked about the Green New Deal a little bit already, and it's not part of it's not part of my presentation, but I think it's really important to bring up in this case. For us, the Green New Deal is probably the best example of repetition, the use of repetition. So when it was introduced in 2019, it was immediately attacked and obsessively attacked by the right. And in doing so, it created a catch-all for what they define as the radical climate agenda. And those dividends are still paying out, right? There's high gas prices, it's the Green New Deal. There's rolling blackouts in Texas or California, it's the Green New Deal. There's an energy crisis in Europe, it's the Green New Deal in Europe, right? this is how it goes. Okay, so lastly, and I'm gonna end it here with this last bullet, data voids or lack of info by reliable media sources allow disinformation and false narratives to pollute. I'd also argue sometimes dominate public discourse on climate and energy issues. I want to talk about the Green New Deal again just for a moment, and then we'll go back to the high gas prices. As Fox and others were toxifying the proposal, their counterparts were barely covering it at all. And this effectively allowed the right wing to dominate the narrative around the Green New Deal, using misinformation like it bans cows, using misinformation like it's going to restrict air travel. Interestingly, in a poll that was conducted roughly 2 months after the Green New Deal resolution was introduced, they found that 37% of Democrats had heard about the Green New Deal a lot. That number in Republicans was 71%. So in a 2-month period, from the time it was introduced until this poll was taken, 71% of their audiences had heard about it a lot. And I can guarantee you that that 71% and the ones that heard about it a little, which was probably the rest of them, were very much against the Green New Deal. So going back to the case study on high gas prices, and I'll wrap up here. So clearly this, the story around gas prices in the last 6 months was universal. Everybody was talking about it. So it's not necessarily an example of data void. But rather than challenge the idea that more drilling was needed to achieve energy independence, or challenge the idea that climate-friendly policies can't achieve energy security, most media coverage reinforced existing conservative narratives around energy and climate policy by accepting that frame, explicitly saying, yeah, maybe we do need to drill, to get us out of this, or just being silent on it altogether and letting Fox and other folks on the right kind of create and control that moment. And I think part of that problem here is to say that there just was not enough content, not enough messaging, not enough narrative, pushing the idea that actually moving away from the reliance on fossil fuel was the path toward energy security. And there's still time to have that conversation. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pass it on to Phil Newell.
Hello, I am the Associate Director of Science Defense at Climate Nexus, and if you read Daily Kos, you might know me as the Climate Denier Roundup. I've been posting there since about 2014, though I go to Breitbart, I go to Fox News, I go to the dredges of the internet and try and return with something valuable for the climate community and reporters who read and folks who are online. The most popular things, though, tend to be when I talk about somebody else's report and be like, oh, look at this cool thing, and that's what people really like. So in that spirit, next slide, I'm going to talk about the Deny, Deceive, Delay report. It is a joint effort of myself and a bunch of other organizations who decided every year there's a climate negotiation, every year disinfo tries to spoil it one way or another. We thought maybe let's try and do something about it this year. It's been 26 times, let's try something new. So we did, we got together and we sort of figured out and built a big monitoring dashboard system. But first, next slide, we all had to decide on what climate disinformation is. And it's sort of defining a negative, right, of disinformation. And there's a lot of ways you could define it. What we ended up with was something pretty broad of, like, if it's wrong on purpose in order to undermine climate policy, then it's climate disinformation. It's a pretty broad category, but that is on purpose. And it is We focus more on disinformation than misinformation because that's really what matters. Like, it's the people creating the propaganda and the memes that then others, share as misinformation. So next slide. You might have heard it's not just it's a hoax now. It's also there are these discourses of delay of maybe somebody saying it's too late, so why bother? Or we should just invest in innovation and that will somehow do it. Or these other issues that are sort of related, but also where it ends up is no need for climate policy now, and that's really what climate disinformation is. There are honest ways you can argue that, but that's not what they're doing. So next slide, whether it is a hoax or it is delay message, how that gets put together is an acronym that you can remember by Flick. You can go look up John Cook, he does great work, but in short, they use fake experts who present logical fallacies and set impossible expectations. They cherry pick what data they have, and they use conspiracy theories to fill in the rest. This works for climate, this works for COVID, this works for election, this works for anti-LGBT stuff. Like, it's pretty across the board. This suite of tactics is something you can come back to again and again. Next slide. So what we actually did was we created some big fancy dashboards that more or less take the content from thousands of actors on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, put all that content into one dashboard, and then rank it by like how much engagement it's getting. And so that let us look at sort of in one screen what all the professional idiots are talking about and their fans. Next slide, let us put together some of these quick and easy visualizations so you can see how bad Twitter is about EV misinformation versus Facebook. So like Michael mentioned, Facebook said, oh yeah, look at all the hundreds of thousands of people that go to our good information center. And we said, well, what about the millions of people who are looking at nonsense that your algorithm puts in front of them? So, the good information is good, but if it's getting out swamped by algorithms that prioritize, engagement or sensationalism over facts and quality content, then it's not going to do you any good. Next slide. So what did we find? Lots of bad stuff, it turns out. So everything from graphs that are misleading or cherry-picked, like I mentioned, to Greta getting spanked by Mother Nature, and you read the gross stuff into that you will, because it's very true. Next slide. Who is actually presenting this information? It's jerks. It's people who are just professionally gross. And I say that and I mean it. The guy on the left here, Peter Sweden, Holocaust denier, has tweeted about like Hitler has some good points. Increasingly, he's getting clout with climate disinformation. So people who are like, follow my Substack and my Patreon so you can hear more about the Great Replacement Theory or whatever else, they realize that climate disinformation is a pretty fertile market for them to get into. On the flip side, people like Michael Schellenberger, who are sort of professionally radical centrists, who say, oh, I'm environmentalist, but like those other environmentalists are always real wrong about stuff, and they're dumb, and we need these other nuclear solutions, and stuff like that. For a while, his shtick was relying on media treating him like, oh, he's liberal, but he's against renewables? Like, how crazy, how, unorthodox. Increasingly, that's not working for him. What is working is being racist. And so he has this taxonomy of woke religion where he says things like, talking about renewables is good is the same as, having your pronouns in your bio, or saying people who are homeless instead of, calling for cops to beat homeless people more, which is sort of his new thing. So that was one of the big findings that's really concerning, is that there is such a robust infrastructure for climate disinformation that other people who are professionally gross online are seeing that as a place where they can recruit and they can find a new audience. And at the same time, the people whose job, more or less, is to spread climate disinformation, because the algorithms at Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, because they prioritize information or disinformation that is salacious, racist content, other bigoted content, it's a way that he can find new funding and a new audience and grow his clout. So that's rather concerning, and I think for all of us it has a message of solidarity and the importance of intersectional work in climate change, because the opposition is certainly working in their sort of dark intersections, as it were. Next slide, and then of course we have to mention Murdoch media and the right-wing media ecosystem, largely built to spread climate disinformation. Some of the sites, like the Daily Wire, founded by billionaire fracking brothers. It does all sorts of gross stuff, including climate disinformation. And obviously Murdoch Media, Fox News, the Wall Street Journal is like, that's where it goes and that's where it spreads and reaches the mainstream. So there's this sort of subterranean group of folks that are in, on the social media channels and chasing clout that way. The big time for them is when they make it to mainstream media and they make it to Fox or the Wall Street Journal. All right, and then final one, we did have some solutions. There is some hope. Again, the first thing we suggested was that official institutions, scientific institutions, also adopt a definition of climate disinformation, so that number two, or 1B and 2, so that platforms can adjust to that definition. And Facebook can say, well, here is the UN definition of climate disinformation, and then we sort of bully them into putting that into their standards, into their community guidelines, so that climate disinformation is no longer allowed, at which point then you have to enforce your platform policies against repeat offenders, because that's the other thing we saw, that it was day in and day out, it's the same couple of dozen accounts who are doing this. You pull the plug on those couple of dozens accounts, and then they have to work in mainstream media, and then they have to pretend to be legitimate instead of being racist, and it's a slight win. There are other more specific things about, restricting paid advertising. Again, we don't let the tobacco industry advertise and have free reign. We shouldn't let the fossil fuel industry do it either. Because it's big and it has all the money and it has lots of sneaky ways of getting its message out, and I think that's what the senator's going to talk about. So I'll end it there.
Thank you, Phil. And yes, I am so pleased to welcome the senator from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all. I'm sorry I'm not in Pittsburgh with you, and I don't even have slides. But I do have a bit of a story to tell, and it begins with the proposition that the fossil fuel industry's two biggest products are hydrocarbons and lies. And the lies are vital to the hydrocarbons and have been for a long time. And if you want to understand why, you can look at the International Monetary Fund report that shows that the effective subsidy for fossil fuels every single year in the United States of America is above $600 billion. That's effectively the harm that they do to the rest of us, that they don't have to put into the price of their product. $600 billion. A price like that into their product would probably disqualify an energy market, so that they know they need to lie and they need to play very aggressively in politics in order to defend the viability of their product. They float on an ocean of lies. And they got very urgent in 2009 when Speaker Pelosi passed a cap and trade bill, and it looked like Congress might actually do something on climate. And in the immediate wake of that, the Supreme Court rendered its Citizens United decision in January of 2010. And the Citizens United decision gave the fossil fuel industry the weaponry to deal with the cap and trade problem of a Congress that might do something. And I'll just say I got to the Senate in 2007, 2008, 2009. There were multiple bipartisan serious climate bills. John McCain ran for the Republican nominee on a respectable climate platform. And in January of 2010, all that bipartisanship came to an absolutely dead stop. There was a kill shot to bipartisanship from the fossil fuel industry, and it was the Citizens United weaponry that enabled that kill shot. And I was pretty despondent, and I started giving speeches about this, which ended up in my weekly Time to Wake Up speeches. And as I had to do that, week in and week out, I began to focus more and more on why we were where we are, not just what the science problem is with climate change, but what the political problem is with climate change. And by 2016, I was organizing colleagues into speeches and group performances on the Senate floor about what we were calling the web of denial. And we were working with a lot of scientists who had done very good work in this space, like Michael Mann and Justin Farrell and Naomi Oreskes and others, showing that there were literally dozens of phony front groups that had been stood up by the fossil fuel industry, funded with enormous amounts of money, and were pulsing out climate denial And at the same time, they had similar groups and sometimes the same groups pushing into the political sphere to silence any Republican who might dare to stick their head up and say something decent about climate. Bob Inglis was the exception to the rule, and they got rid of him very quickly. In 2018, to get a little bit more scientific, organized, rapid response, I started a Google Groups listserv called Science Defenders, and Phil Newell, thank you, Phil, is now the administrator of that listserv. For all of you who are scientists, let me say we started 2 listservs. One was scientists. That one took off on its own. I have no role in it any longer other than to be, listen to it and be connected to it. But it is completely self-perpetuating. It is completely self-motivated. It is running. I did the same thing with lawyers. And as soon as we stopped pushing it, it collapsed. So as a lawyer, I'm a little embarrassed by all that, but the scientists came through strong. So what are we going to do about all of this? Well, the work of the Climate Disinformation Coalition, of Media Matters, and of Climate Nexus is just spectacularly important. The disinformation is the Death Star of the whole climate denial operation. And if we can figure out how to deal with that, and exposing it as one of the best ways to deal with that, then we begin to move towards having a significant victory. There's one thing that I would flag, and it's something we should all be pressuring the Biden administration on, and that is litigation on climate. Many states have begun to litigate about the climate nuisance, the climate damage, and the climate fraud. Many municipalities have begun to litigate. The Department of Justice sits on its hands idle. It appears to have done literally no research or inquiry into what the federal government's role should be with all of these state lawsuits that are going forward. And that is unfortunate because they have a very, very good federal precedent in front of them. And that was the tobacco litigation that was brought in 1999. It was a civil case brought under the civil provisions of the RICO statute. And it argued that the tobacco industry was saying fraudulent things about the harms of its product. Sound familiar? Well, they won. In 2006, Judge Gladys Kessler, a federal district judge in Washington, D.C., wrote a, I want to say, 1,200-page long decision, just hammering the facts that the government had produced down the throat of the tobacco industry. And it ended up with a court order. Tobacco industry, thou shalt lie no more. And you can take that complaint and you can pull out tobacco and put in hydrocarbons or fossil fuel, and you can take out health and put in health and planetary safety. And the complaint more or less writes itself. So I've been pressuring the department for a while to take an honest look at this. That's all I can ask. It's their own decision whether to proceed. But to this day, they have not taken an honest look. Years have gone by. It is long overdue, and the evidence is quite abundant. I'll close by saying that the propagation of lies and the propagation of political influence that intersects with those lies is all supported by enormous amounts of dark money. And the dark money operation is very significant to all of us. It was behind climate denial. It is behind Mitch McConnell's so-called independent expenditures when he drops tens of millions of dollars into Senate races. It was behind voter suppression, as the Heritage Action folks admitted, caught on tape. And it's behind the capture of the Supreme Court, if you look at what the Federalist Society and Judicial Crisis Network and others did. So if you're looking for a Death Star of people who are really up to no good in our democracy, that core dark money apparatus is behind not only the climate denial mess that we're stuck with, but a lot of other evils in our society as well. So thank you for keeping your eye on the ball here, and whatever I can do to help continue to put the spotlight on the lies and on the dark money and on the fact that climate denial is the product of an apparatus, I would love to do. So it's great to be a part of this, and thank you for including me.
Thank you so much. So we have plenty of time. I have a couple of questions, and I want to make sure we have time for folks in the audience who have questions too. Senator, and maybe Michael too, I'm going to start with you. The Digital Services Act just passed in, the Digital Services Package just passed in EU Parliament. It puts onus on the tech companies to create safe digital spaces and protect their users from harmful disinformation. There's an American companion bill, but frankly, there is so much legislation, proposed legislation, that I have seen since I've been working in the disinformation space from good to great, that I worry has no chance of passing. So what is possible in Congress where we know that both parties have anger at tech companies and for different reason? And Senator, for you especially, is it possible to work with your colleagues who believe a lot of this disinformation themselves on combating it?
Well, first, let me say that I think the EU developing this will force big platforms to adjust their logarithms. It's a little bit like California setting clean air standards. They're big enough that the platforms will have to adjust even if the US Congress is too tied up to do anything. The thing that I would like to do, because it's incredibly simple and easy to explain, is to take away the litigation immunity that they have so that if they lie about somebody, then they can be sued. And we have seen the lies of the big lie being pursued by, Dominion, which has sued Fox and others for lying about the election. And it's $1 billion lawsuit, and it's serious, and they have every chance of winning. And in a court, you can't lie, and you got to show up for depositions, and you got to turn over documents, and it's really brilliant. And we also just saw Alex Jones take a huge punch in the face, a well-deserved one, from the Sandy Hook parents. Again, honest courtrooms are places where a lot of this evil can be sorted out. And the exemption that those big platforms have had from having to face an honest courtroom, I think, has enabled them to be very reckless in the kind of material that they allow to get across their platforms. And yeah, it's interesting with my colleagues. There's some who I suppose might still believe that climate's a great big old hoax, but most of them understand that they have to say this because they are completely supported by fossil fuel money. There's just tens of millions of fossil fuel money going into Republican Senate races every single year. Mitch McConnell controls tens of millions of dollars so that some of his colleagues don't even have to really raise money. They just go to Mitch and say, Mitch, help me out here. And he arranges bombardments of smear ads and, the tsunami of slime. And they just don't have the courage to stand up to that pressure. It's just too important to them. It would be like a deep sea diver cutting off his oxygen hose. And until we find a way around that, and I think exposing and discrediting that dark money is vital to this. Those things intersect very, very closely.
Koch network spent over $1 billion on the 2020 election cycle, by the way. So just $1 billion just from the Koch network, just on the 2020 election cycle.
And that's what we know.
Exactly. And I would just add, at the end of the day, these companies are they care about public pressure. They may not do a ton of things that we want, but they are still trying to put on the smokescreen that they are actually doing things. So the combination of that, which exists in this country, and a law that's going to show that what they're saying, when we present to them a well-researched report like Allison and others do, they say, oh, your numbers are way off. You don't understand the ecosystem. Well, now we have the ecosystem. So at least we have that strong starting point to, again, appeal to the public shame that they are actually subject to. So in absence of a Congress that's functional or a captive court, that's what we have for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. My next question is for Allison and Phil. You two have been tracking climate disinformation in mainstream and social media longer than most. At the same time, we've seen an increased dose of reality on the climate front in that there are more and more extreme weather events every year. My question for you is, as we've seen, how are bad actors responding? Are you seeing more information? Are you seeing less? Is it getting more conspiratorial? I'd love to give folks a sense of how reality is changing.
It was the arsons that started the fire.
It kind of ebbs and flows, right? So some of the folks that have tracked it and done some of the sort of quantitative research over a decade or two, that denial and delay, that it's a hoax versus I believe in it, but we don't need these policies. When there isn't any policy on the horizon, then it's a hoax, right? When there's a policy that is looking imminent, when Democrats might have control, that's when they're like, oh no, we're respectable, we believe in climate change, it's just we think more gas is the answer, right? So it kind of goes back and forth, and it depends on what they're responding to, because they are just responding to what's out there. So yeah, the more extreme weather, the more we hammer that extreme weather is related to climate change and climate change worsens these things, the more they sort of react with like, okay, but then let's just like build higher seawalls and maybe that'll be fine, right? And so they shift in reaction, but the core message is still the same of like, no, we still need fossil fuels. So that baseline always stays the same, and you know, it gets wacky or more respectable depending on sort of how they need to be seen as credible to moderates and to the mainstream media versus riling up their base and making sure that there's that strong core 20, 30% of the country that just thinks it's a hoax.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that, I think it's also important to add that the denial of climate science is not gone, and it's still being featured in Fox News and even on the opinion pages of the Washington Post. So recently, we responded to an opinion piece by Mark Thiessen. Am I saying it right? Mark Thiessen, who is a Fox News contributor. He is a fellow at one of the institutes, Competitive Energy Institute, I think.
American Enterprise, maybe?
Yeah. But he also has a column, he also periodically writes a column for the Washington Post. He was able to get through their editorial process and their fact checkers to print information basically saying that the Earth is not warming in response to I think blackouts or extreme weather that was going to contribute to rolling blackouts this summer. His argument was, no, the rolling blackouts are because of coal closures and climate change is a hoax. And that was in the Washington Post opinion pages a couple of months ago. So, so these things are not gone. They have not been eradicated, and we still have to watch out for them and call them out when we see them.
Right. The other thing is Republican polling knows that to win white women in the suburbs, they need to not say that it's a hoax, because that makes them look crazy. And so that's part of it too, is every election cycle they soften a little bit and try to appeal to those moderate voters by saying, oh, I believe in it, I'm not a science denier, like I'm not crazy, but, and then of course after that but is crazy science denial.
So this next question is for all the panelists, and you can answer in any order if you have thoughts. One thing that I think is a big misunderstanding about disinformation is just how much money is behind it. And Senator Whitehouse brought this up when he talked about dark money. And so much of the tech policies that we get from the tech platforms either focus on organic content and not ads, or they do the Twitter thing where they ban election ads, but it's perfectly okay for fossil fuel companies to run ads. Can folks speak to the role that ads and money play in disinformation and some of the ways we might be able to curb it?
So ad budgets are huge, and they add, like fossil fuel companies greenwash, right, with their ads. So they'll spend $1 million on their, biofuel algae, and then spend $10 million advertising about how they're doing this next generation thing. And it's orders of magnitude more telling you that they're doing the good thing than it is actually doing the good thing. Like I mentioned, Koch network spent $1 billion on just on an election cycle. It brought in like $2 billion, and that other went to all the other sundry nonsense that they're doing. So it is hundreds of millions of dollars a year sort of in these networks of front groups and think tanks. And then it's the actual ad budgets of Exxon and BP and these companies with all the money. And it's more money than I would like to think about, because it's not mine and it shouldn't exist.
Just two quick things on that. One, Michael Mann at Brown University has just done a very good report on the role of the advertising industry in pushing out climate denial. And, typical, it's a really good piece of work. It's very well researched. And we as Democrats have not managed to execute on it in any meaningful way. There's been no pressure on the big ad firms that have basically marketed climate denial They have other corporate clients who don't find that to be a badge of dishonor that caused them to go away. We put no pressure on the industry that has polished up the lies into what is, as Phil said, kind of socially acceptable. And as they fall back from trench to trench, first it was hoax, and then it was, well, we're not sure, and now it's too expensive, and you can sort of track the latest of climate denial. And the second thing is there's really no such thing as too much money for them to spend. If you go back to that IMF number, if your industry depends on an annual subsidy that you get of $600 billion every year, then if you spend $6 billion every year on political manipulation, which is a pretty big number, you're getting a 100-to-1 return on your investment every single damn year. So the danger here is that the value to this big industry of this cascade of lies is so great that the spigot of money is unlimited, and that's why exposing it matters so much, because it becomes discredited if you can see it.
And I think it just add there's two really great partners that we work with who have campaigns that are focused on this. One, Clean Creatives, is a group that's been focused on removing the social license to work or to have clients if you're at an ad agency that are fossil fuel clients, and that's been a great movement forward. Another one who works on a different part of the ad industry, Claire and
Check My Ads.
Thank you, Check My Ads, and they're working on the ad tech sort of middle slice where they're focused on actually brands who just like buy ads on these giant services and they don't know where they're ending up. But actually what we find out is that disinformation websites are earning like up to $3 billion a year through these things of brands who don't want to be associated. So I think our strength is to focus on the people who don't have a endless sort of existential reason to be there. Like Exxon is always going to try and spend $600 billion, but L'Oreal does not want to be next to Ben Shapiro's latest screed about trans youth. So there's two sort of interesting and hopeful campaigns.
All right, so we have some time for questions, a few questions from the audience. If you could raise your hand if you have a question, and I would ask very politely that your question be a question. Please don't be that guy at Netroots, and I say that with all love. If you have a question, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, so I'm concerned that now, Bill probably answered this with your flick model. We do have this entire conference is really about justice of all kinds and doing the right thing. But we have, since we don't own a media channel collectively, you now have the Securities and Exchange Commission coming out with, we're going to grade companies and your performance will be based on how well you do against your environmental and social goals. This entire conference is about ESG and doing well on your ESG. And now I've seen the attacks come from the other side. How can we prevent that from bleeding over into the SEC requirements?
So the question is about ESG and the attacks on ESG. And I know some of my panelists have some thoughts on that. You can see the smiles here.
Yes, a big topic. The last year or so, the Koch network has been really sowing the field and laying the groundwork for that. And we've seen it in the past few months. Mike Pence's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal is the big one. What we can actually do, I mean, the problem is we can't stop them. Like we can't we're not the ones insurrectioning Mike Pence. So beyond that, like you can't make them stop. You can submit your own comments to the SEC, right? So there is the regulatory process, and it does account for facts, right? And so you can go and look at the comment that 21 state AGs just submitted, all Republicans, all heavily funded by the fossil fuel industry, and you can say, and sort of do the work for the SEC, so when they're going through their comments and they see a bunch of nonsense, and then they see somebody saying, oh, here's why all that nonsense is wrong, and then they don't have to waste their time. When they reply to that comment, they can say, oh, well, here are the actual facts, and here's reality, and like that. So some of it is a matter of putting out the correct information and the good information, and some of it is just sort of day in, day out hammering where and when you can, and posting about it yourself, yourself and writing in letters to your local newspaper, letter to the editor, or op-eds. There's an op-ed recently in Impact Alpha, which is a financial publication, more or less terming some of these guys like the Alex Jones of investing, right? And it's the InfoWars investing model is the folks who are attacking ESG, and it's a great moniker. And so it's finding things like that to, personally, I love making fun of them. Like, that's what I do every day, is I mock them for my audience here, and that sort of punctures some of it. And humor is a way to make really boring stuff actually seem a little fun, and it's your little treat for reading your homework and reading why these people are wrong. And a lot of it's just exposing the fossil fuel ties, right? Because if you hear somebody give an opinion and they are, an unbiased independent expert, that's one thing. If they're a fake expert who's actually getting funded, if they're the 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Crest and the 5th recommends no fluoride because it'll rot your teeth, or make you go, whatever the fluoride conspiracies are. I don't know that one that well, but if he's getting money from the anti-fluoride company, this metaphor really fell apart. Expose that they're getting paid to lie. That's the real trick. Is that for ESG, it's the losers have funded people to say, don't look at risk and invest in us anyway, even though we're risky. So you show that you expose those financial flows, and they become less persuasive as a result.
And I think I'd add that the SEC is only one financial part of the global market. And the thing I love about the woke ESG attacks is that it really exposes how deeply anti-democratic their side has become. They've corrupted the courts, they've corrupted Congress. The only thing left is actually capitalism holding them back, which is a terrible state. But now they're going to go say the market is wrong. It's just not. It seems to me like this is actually their final overreach, because they actually only control the captive, even if they own the SEC. But it's a global market, right? ESG funds are all across the globe. They're very strong in Europe, and you're not really going to be able to change that in Europe. So, have at it.
I would add that it also reflects the growing spread of the dark money political apparatus. They focused immediately on Congress because they were panicked by 2009 cap and trade, and they had this new weaponry from Citizens United, and so they beat the Republican Party into submission in Congress and basically made the Republican Party in Congress the political wing of the fossil fuel industry. But they hadn't pushed their way down into state government so far. But RAGA, the Republican Attorney General's Association, has more or less been entirely taken over by the fossil fuel industry. West Virginia versus EPA was litigated by them on behalf of the fossil fuel industry. And with this ESG things, it's state treasurers who did not used to be this way, who've now been dialed up by fossil fuel industry donors to make an objection as state treasurers to the proposition that financial houses should require accurate disclosure of risk to shareholders and investors, which is a wild proposition for treasurers to sign on to. But when the fossil fuel money reaches down into that tranche of the political spectrum, there they go.
All right, I think we have time for one more audience question. All right, well, is there one? Okay, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing. All right.
This is mostly for Ms. Fisher, but in respect to the void of information, would you say that it's getting better or getting worse? And are there specific ways that we can pressure that area?
Yeah, I think, oops, sorry.
Don't forget, repeat the question.
So the question was, is the data void getting better or worse, and are there things that we can do about it? So this is definitely near and dear to my heart in the work that we do at Media Matters. So in addition to correcting and tracking and monitoring disinformation, we also advocate for substantive, good, and consistent climate policy, climate reporting and coverage. So the data void, there are too many examples when climate and energy or headline news and Fox News is spending every hour on the hour talking about it and framing it and shaping the conversation around that particular piece of legislation or that particular action or regulation. Their counterparts are doing very little to counter that. They're barely mentioning it. They're not creating any sort of content around it. So I think what we do is to point that out. We do studies to say, here's how it was covered on Fox News, here's how it was covered on broadcast, here's how it was covered on cables, to show that disparity in those key moments, and then push that out and try to create some accountability around it. So those data voids are, and we've seen this time and time again. Another good example was the big oil hearings that happened, were those this year? This spring. There was a couple, but at any rate, this spring there was big oil hearings. It was the ones that were focused on the price gouging. So this was again a narrative that was run very much counter to what was happening on Fox News. They wanted Biden to be the blame, not big oil, and so they spent twice as much time covering those big oil hearings than their counterparts together on CNN and MSNBC. So this is a problem. This is a big problem. That was an opportunity for CNN and MSNBC to make their audiences more conversant about what actually was going on with the global market, what actual role the oil companies were playing in the high gas prices, and they just didn't do it. So what can be done about it? We just have to keep pressure on them. What we do about it is we document it and we put it out there in front of them and to other people in the world to keep that pressure on.
Yeah, corporate TV media is always going to suck. We just have to be really loud and annoying and really persistent. And that's really like, you look at the polling and the vast majority of Americans, 70, 80%, 90% support, regulations on coal plants and renewable energy. If we have 90% of the people supporting more solar and wind, like clearly you can talk about it with your neighbors and with your friends and in real life, because that's what, the fossil fuel industry doesn't have is actual popular support, and that's what we do have. So that's the only way we're going to be able to close that gap is by just like being that guy that talks about it all the time until your friends hate you, and then you find new friends and talk about it with them all the time.
One strategic PowerPoint is to put pressure on the corporations that are not fossil fuel companies, but whose trade associations are doing nothing or are doing harm, who are supporting the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, identified as our worst climate obstructors. If there's a big vulnerability for corporate America, it's that they tell their shareholders and the public one thing about climate, and through their trade associations and through their lobby groups, they tell Congress something very different. And they have not been exposed to that vulnerability anywhere near enough. They are getting away with being very two-faced. And the trade associations and the lobby groups are a big point of weakness for them that further exposure can exploit.
All right, and with that, we are at time. I want to thank all of our panelists so much, and again, thank you all for being here. Those of us on the stage will be around, I'm sure, for a minute or two if you have additional questions. Thanks.